What is up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Travis. This is TWA Motorsports, and today we are back on the green truck, and I'm excited about it because we're going to get some more stuff accomplished today. So the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to get that motor plate out of the way, put the valley cover where it needs to be, including the new gasket. I'm going to try to get a lot of these wires hooked up today, and if you guys noticed in the last video, I told you I was going to have my wife and son help me put on the hood. The hood is on. I probably shouldn't have put it on for purposes of lighting, but hopefully with my light up here, you guys are able to see what's going on. So like I said, we're just gonna kind of work our way through just random stuff. I don't really have an agenda, just trying to hook everything back up, get stuff back into place. So we'll just go a little bit at a time. So we'll just kind of see how far this video goes. Like I said, I probably think we have another 2, maybe 3 videos before it's actually on the road. But let's get started with that valley cover. So once I move my wires kind of out of the valley here, we're going to go ahead and take the lift plate off. This thing is so handy for putting LS motors in, it's ridiculous. And I'm going to go ahead and pull the towels out, and I'm probably going to wipe that down one more time, just the surface here. I did scrape it off when I had the motor out, but just to make sure no debris falling on there, I'm going to clean that off real well, and then I'm going to grab the gasket, and I'm going to kind of do like I did before on the oil pan. I'm going to thread all the bolts in individually into the gasket because they'll help hold the gasket in place, and then we'll try to set it in place. So as you can see, I've got the new gasket on. Just a new GM gasket is what I like to use. The other thing, guys, is because this is an older motor, it does have the knock sensors in the center of the block. Make sure that these guys are in good shape. You can get replacements for those as well. Mine were good, so I didn't replace those, but I am going to be replacing the knock sensor and the harness, but that'll come later. Anyway, like I said, I threaded, you can see I partially threaded the bolts in there. So we're going to set this thing into place and at least get it snug down, and then we'll come back and torque it. So now that I've got them ran down by hand, we're going to go ahead and torque them. Like I said, I'm going to start in the middle. It's going to be very similar to the way I would bolt down a head. So center and then outside and working my way out, going back and forth. 18 foot-pounds is all this gets, so it's not much. And sometimes, guys, the gasket likes to smash and you don't get a correct torque reading, especially on the very back ones. So just be careful, take your time. Now that we got that in place, I'm going to move over here to this guy. We're going to hook up the fuses, basically the whole swap part. And the cool thing about this on these trucks is it's pretty much plug and play. I took some time and tried to clean this up the best I could. And I got a few additional relays on here that you guys may not have because I added the I added some fog lights, but we need to lift this out of place. And we'll get it all tied up here. Wish I get this to stay. There we go. Anyway, we'll get this out of place and see if we can get some wiring underneath here. Uh-oh. Looks like at some point there's been a mouse in here. It's not good. I'm going to vacuum this out. I swear I took this out when I did this, but I'm wondering if a mouse got in here since then. Anyway, I'm going to vacuum this out real quick, and then we will get the wires. Obviously, we need this main plug here to come up the bottom side, and then we're going to need a few additional plugs like this guy here, but I'll show you that after I get it cleaned out here. So I got it all cleaned out. Let's see if we can get this wiring through here. So this right here needs to come up underneath. So all this guy here, this is the main plug that we need to use a 7mm to install. This guy right here. I'm going to go grab a 7 and tighten that down. That's the main one. Once I get that one, I think we can move the wires around where we need them. See if I can kind of tuck a few under here. I will say that this piece right here is already in place on the truck. I actually left it there, so I'm going to have to take that off, so I'll need a flat head as well. But let me grab that 7 and we'll get this main plug snug down. And once you get it plugged in, the majority of the way, this should drag it the rest of the way. But you want to make sure this is tight or it won't run at all. We got that in there. Now, like I said, we're going to try to route a few of these wires underneath. So pretty easy here, black to black plug. I wish there was more light in here, guys, but and then we have 2 blue plugs here, obviously blue to blue. They make it very simple for you, for the guy that wants to do this swap. So I did some checking just to make sure. I went out to the other truck and no, that extra plug was actually not plugged into anything, so we should be good. The other thing I noticed is there's a couple plugs that are hanging out back here, and I believe that's for equipment that this truck didn't have because I never did take those off. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and put this back into place and try to tuck all my wires in real nice. As I said, I added those fog lights. So I got my relay back here on the back. So there's more stuff for me to deal with than you guys will probably have unless you did the same thing. But at this point, I'm just going to set this back on here. At some point, we're going to have to take it back off because we are going to have to hook up like this guy here. I guess technically I could go ahead and do that, but I'm going to be reaching down in here and that can be done later. So I'm going to leave this here for now. I just wanted to get those wires out of the way. That was a big clump of wires that I didn't want to have to deal with. The other thing is I may end up having to change this. I'm going to have to do a little research on it. I don't really want to change the throttle cable if I don't have to, but you know, I can always do that. It's pretty simple to reach. It's right here. I may have to reach up under the dash in order to get it, but I think we can do that. Anyway, I think I'm going to move on to the power steering pump. I'm going to try to hook it up because it's still dripping a little bit. I've got it tied up with a bag down there, but that would be nice so it's not like dripping in my face when I'm under this thing. So I'm going to go ahead and not too much there, just two transitions between the truck or the rack itself and the actual power steering pump. So I'm just going to bolt those together real quick, like I said, to keep crap out of my eyes. So I wanted to show you here what I hooked up, and sorry if you're getting some glare, but just use a set of pliers to put the return line on because there's not a lot of pressure there. It's the feed line that has an actual fitting, and I used a 3/4 and I believe a 5/8 here to tighten that up. Also make sure that your gasket, there's a little rubber grommet here, make sure that it looks good, and mine did look like it was in good shape. So we'll just have to check once we get this thing fired up, but now at least, like I said, it won't be leaking. I did put a towel under it, but it didn't leak anything. I just know that it was leaking a little bit on the engine stand. So let's keep moving. We'll find something else here. I may move on to the passenger side over here of the engine and see if we can get some of that wiring routed. Let's take a look at what I want to work on next. So as you guys know, we got some of the wiring sorted out, but now I want to move on before I get under the car and start routing some of the wires. Like I said, I actually think I'm going to go ahead and start with the intake. I'm going to go ahead and try to get it in place, and then maybe we can see where our wires need to go as far as routing them. I mean, I kind of have an idea, but before we do that, I did buy a couple new things. So obviously, anytime you take knock sensors out, I always like to replace them because, guys, it's not a huge project or undertaking, but in my opinion, it's worth replacing. I only buy AC Delco ones, so I did buy 2 new ones. The other thing is, if you look at the coolant crossover pipe, which we're going to be putting back in, there are little gaskets on it, and I like to replace those as well. No sense in not doing it while you're here. They're cheap. I'll list all this in the description down below. The other thing is the harness for the knock sensors themselves. These things are known to get brittle, and they might look good, but the plugs wear out, and so I like to replace that as well. So we're going to get all this into place. I'm going to start by grabbing the knock sensors. We'll spin those down into their proper spot, and then we'll talk about torque specs on all of this stuff. So as you can see, I've got the knock sensors spun down into place. Make sure you don't cross thread these guys. And 15 foot-pounds, so not a whole lot goes on these. Make sure you get them to at least 15. Now that we have those torqued down, I'm ready to put the coolant crossover tube. I'm actually going to put it in first and then the harness in second, just because it seems like you have to bend it around if you don't. So I like to put the harness in after I do the coolant crossover tube. But before you do that, I like to take, and I already done this, I clean off the surface that these are going to mount to, and you have 4 of them. So there's 2 on the back side of the head and 2 on the front side. And then I did go ahead and put my new gaskets on there. The couple things you want to make sure of: make sure that your old gaskets are off of here, and then I clean this up as well before I put the new one on. And the same thing on the head. So you don't want to have double gaskets, because then you'll have a leak. So make sure they're really, really thin, guys. And so it's easy to double up on them because you can't really see them. Just make sure they're not in place, and we're going to go ahead and set that on and get the 4 bolts started. Now that we have this in place, you want to make sure that your gasket obviously doesn't swing out. Make sure that they're all directly under this shape. So they're kind of an oval shape. Make sure they're directly under that. We can go ahead and tighten all 4 of these to 106 inch-pounds. Now that's inch-pounds, not foot-pounds. Not a whole lot goes on these. Now that we have those torqued down, I'm going to go ahead and install this guy. And so guys, these, you will have to pull this up. So you push these on, and they clip, and then I kind of like to tug on them to make sure they're seated, and then you can seat these in place just to keep junk out of them. A lot of times you'll pull these engines apart and there'll be water here, so make sure there's no water. Obviously we pulled the engine out, but both of them are clipped good. So I'm going to push these in place, and we'll route that wire back behind. Now that the harness is all seated, I'm ready to put the intake on, but you can see that this thing is really, really gross. It's got a ton of debris from, just honestly, guys, dust and junk just settles under here. So I did go ahead and take the 8mm out. There's only 4 of them that holds the fuel rail here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean them up separately. I've got my vacuum out here, and I'm going to take a brush. I'm not going to show you guys this, but I wanted to give you guys an idea of what actually goes on when I'm putting stuff together. It's really kind of a sickness. But I can't put this in like this. Now most people probably would, and it's probably not going to hurt anything. The other thing is, once I get it cleaned up, I'll show you guys, we are going to replace the intake gasket. It's pretty common for them to fail on these, so there's no sense in, while you're putting it on, not to replace those. But I'm going to spend probably an hour, if not more, cleaning this up, and then we'll get into how we're going to install it and doing the intake gaskets. Now that I have the intake as clean as I'm going to be able to get it, I mean, you guys, you could spend a ton of time on this. I spent about 2 hours, but it's clean. But there's a few things that I want to do, obviously, before I put it on. And one of those things is we are going to be replacing the intake gaskets, which I will list down below like always. These are factory GM gaskets. And guys, these things literally just clip in place. But before I clip them in place, I am going to go over this one more time, this surface here, and get that all cleaned up before I snap those into place. I'll show you once I get them snapped in. When you turn it upside down, some of your bolts do want to get kind of crazy. That's okay. For the most part, they generally hold in, and when we flip it back over, it'll be fine. Also, I took the time and cleaned every one of the injectors with some brake clean. And not only did I use a little bit of, I used a Q-tip to clean them, but I sprayed them several times. Now, there are ways out there, you guys can look it up if you want to clean them by using transmission fluid, I think is what most people use. But after we get this finished, I'm not going to be using the EGR, so I'm going to show you what I'm going to put here in place of the EGR. And then the other thing is, I am not going to be using the throttle bypass. So how this works is, and it's really kind of weird, but fluid comes in and supposedly heats this up. And I bypass this on all my Trans Ams, so I'm going to do the same here. So all I'm going to do is put 2 vacuum caps on that, and I'll show you that as well once I'm all finished up. But let's get this cleaned up. I'll get those intake gaskets on. I'll show you that. I'll show you these plugs, and then I'll show you what we're going to be using to block the EGR, since we are going to be using headers on this truck. So now we have those on, and they just clip. There's a clip here. There's a clip here on the center, and then there's a clip on the back. So there's only 3 clips that hold it on, and they're not side specific, so you can't get it wrong just as long as the cathedral part matches. So got those on, and then just 1/4-inch vacuum caps is all I'm using here. Just cheap rubber caps, and you don't have to do this, but it just keeps junk out of that, and to me, I've always done that. So here's what we're going to be using to block off the EGR. So this kit that I bought comes with, if you were going to delete EGR and the evap on a vehicle, and this right here blocks off the EGR that goes to the actual exhaust manifold. So we're not going to be using that, because the headers I'm going to order are not going to have that on them. The only thing we're actually going to be using is this guy here, but I thought down the road I might use this evap one if I do when I do the motor swap in my old truck, because I'm not going to have an evap line that runs to the front. So on this truck we will, because it does have a factory evap. I am going to hook that back up. But for this guy, it does come with this and the bracket and the bolt, and it also comes with obviously the driver or the Allen key, so you can put it in. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in place. I'll show you it, and then we'll get it on the truck. So you can see I've got it in place, and it has a nice little countersunk bolt that goes in there, makes it look real nice. If you lose that, you can use the factory one. Not a big deal. It doesn't set as flush as I'd like it to, but it's stationary. It's not going to go anywhere, and I don't think there's going to be a leak because there's a rubber gasket around it. But now we're ready. I'm going to go ahead and pull off all this tape. I'm going to go once over this with some brake clean as well, get it nice and clean, and then we are going to swing this thing into place. And so while you're doing this, obviously guys, you're going to have to lift this guy up and kind of keep it out of the way. But I really want to do this next, because that gives me the ability to start routing all this wire where I want it to go. So at this point, we're ready to put this thing in place. And so guys, I've got the the brake vacuum kind of pushed up towards me. And you're probably going to have to move some wires around. Like I said, I wanted to do this so I could route my wires where I wanted them. You don't want to pinch anything. And make sure it sets nice and flush on here. And you'll know because see that? There's no rocking. Nice and flush. And then we can kind of route our wires. Like I said, I'm going to shine my light back there and make sure there's nothing pinched, but we should be able to go ahead and kind of start a couple of these bolts by hand all the way back. And there is a torque sequence on this. We'll talk about it here in just a minute, but basically we work from the middle out, similar to what we would on a head. So at this point, I'm ready to torque it down. I've got them just finger tight. There's no wires pinched in the back. I made sure I put my light back there. But I'm going to show you guys. Hopefully you can see that. I'll leave it up here for a second. This is the torque sequence for this truck. Now, you need to do it twice. So 44 inch-pounds the first time. Now, inch-pounds, not foot-pounds. And then 89 inch-pounds the second pass. So following that same diagram, we're going to go through. I won't show you guys that. I'm going to tighten them all up. And then we can really start routing these wires, which is going to be exciting for me, because kind of right now I've just got a jumbled up mess. And I'll just kind of show you guys. That big main harness goes on the top, and it's really kind of an ugly engine without the cover on it. I am going to put the cover back on, but I just wanted to show you guys what the torque sequence was, and we'll torque those down, like I said, 44 and then 89. At this point, I've got everything torqued down, and so how this kind of routes is there's sections here where you can see the wire goes in between these two spots and this section, and it kind of lays down in these channels on this thing. So it kind of fits nicely. And then there's a 10 millimeter nut, and by the way, those are 8 millimeters for the intake. I think I said 10 earlier, but this little nut here, we swing this into place, and then we can bolt this down. That's that main harness. Like I said, it looks so ugly on the top of the engine. If you were ever going to do one, a swap in another vehicle, to me, the F-body style that comes in from the back side on the passenger side head is way nicer looking than this, because you don't want all this junk. I would want mine to come in from the back. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and start routing some of my wires, like I said, now that we've got this in place. And then we can everything's going to kind of line up on its own. You may have to, I may have to go ahead and put this vacuum line in place that goes from here to the back of the head. I really probably need a new PCV, and I'm not sure, I may end up running a catch can on this thing. But for now, I'm just going to kind of tidy things up, get some wires into place, and then we'll go to the next step, which is, I don't know, we may push this thing out, try to get the trans in it. I'm not really sure what I'll do next. So I'm going to show you guys everything I've got hooked up. So obviously we hooked up all the injectors. I'm going to try to hold the light. It might be a little noisy while I hold the light in the camera, but so we've got everything hooked up here. So idle air control, throttle body, position sensor. We've got, this goes to the alternator, so we got all that hooked up. We've got the evap hooked up. That's that guy on the top. And what else? Oh, back here in the back, we got the map sensor hooked up, which comes off this back wire. And then the actual knock sensors, that harness comes up and under and actually clips here and plugs in with this run. From there, we did go ahead and hook the ground up on the actual firewall here. I did go ahead and plug the brake booster in after running the lines around where I wanted them. Of course, all the injectors are plugged in and they kind of line up and in the order they go. So other than that, the only thing we have left to hook up on this side, or if you see a plug, we've obviously got the coil packs, which we won't put on until we actually get the valve covers that I'm going to be using on. Same thing on the other side. I did route, you can use the stock cable, throttle body cable. I don't know whether I'll use it or not, but for now I've kept it loose because, like I said, I think I'm going to put a new PCV in because I think that old one's just, you know, needs to be replaced. On this side, like I said, though, coil pack, all the injectors are hooked up. I did go ahead and route the wire on the along the firewall, plugged into the AC, and then went down, and we'll hook up those when we get underneath the truck. Brought over here, I already had this hooked up, but I had to move it because I didn't like the way it was routed. The bottom of the overflow, and then this goes to the mass airflow sensor. So got everything hooked up for the most part. Now I don't have an alternator yet, so I haven't put it on, and obviously I don't have the harmonic balancer on. But what I think at this point we'll do is I'm going to give it the transmission a good cleaning. We'll get under there and we will put the flywheel on, get the converter in that I'm going to be using. We'll talk about that when I get to it, but I want to push it outside so I have a little more light to show you guys what's going on, especially since I'm going to be under the truck, and we'll get started hopefully on that transmission. So I changed my mind on pulling it outside. It's just a hassle by myself to do that. What I've done though is I've got it as high as I can get it on, my homemade wheel stands here, and then some jack stands in the back. But I want to roll underneath here and show you guys what my next thing we're going to be doing is. So I did go ahead and put the lines that come down, basically that go to the coolant reservoir. There's a line that comes over here, and I went ahead and snapped all that into place. So back where it goes, these are for the O2 sensors, the rear O2 here, the front O2, and then that goes up this fender here. Actually, maybe this is the O2. Oh no, never mind, that's the transmission. I've just got it looped over here. The transmission stuff, I do have routed over here just to keep it out of the way, but I actually think there's a clip on it. Maybe not, maybe I'm crazy. But I just want it out of the way so we can get the transmission up into place. But at this point, I'm gonna put the flywheel on, or I call it the flywheel, I guess it's actually a flex plate. I'm gonna show you guys the converter that I'm gonna be using. I am gonna, for now, I've went back and forth 100 times on this, whether I'm gonna put a 4L80 in this or a 4L60. Since I went ahead and bought the converter, I'm gonna do a 4L60 for now. Now, chances are it will blow up at some point. And if we ever do a turbo, then obviously we're gonna have to put an 80 in here. But for now, I am gonna put the 60. So I'll roll back out. I'll show you a couple things that I wanna check before I actually put this in place. And then we'll get the flywheel in, followed by, we'll put the converter in the transmission, but we'll talk about that next. So here's what I'm wanting to check. First of all, the converter that I'm using is actually a Trailblazer converter out of a inline 6-cylinder Trailblazer. Now this is pretty common for people to use in these trucks because it stalls a little bit higher than your factory converter, but it's not crazy. So it's like 500 stall speed higher than the factory V8 converter. So it gives it a little more pep, but you're not having a big, huge converter. And to be honest with you, because I knew down the road I'd be going with an 80, these are relatively cheap, and for what I'm doing for now, this will work. And I did buy a remanufactured one instead of a new one, but I'll list that in the parts below, because the remanufactured one are actually made a little bit nicer. They're put together a little bit better. But I'm going to flip this thing over, and the reason I'm going to do that, guys, is in the past, I've got all this up there and everything was fine, but I want to make sure that my bolt holes line up, because sometimes they don't. And if they don't, it sure is easier to test it here than it is to get it up in the truck, everything bolted together, and then have to take it all back down because something doesn't line up. The other thing you want to do is make sure that your bolts, which I ordered some new ones, these are just Dorman. And like I said, I didn't go with ARP because I think down the road we'll be swapping this trans out. But these are just Dorman bolts. I'll list those below as well. Wanted some new ones since obviously I had some issues getting the old ones out. But you want to make sure that your bolts thread in there as well. Had it in the past where you get everything up there and the bolts won't thread in because the thread is different. So we're going to flip this thing over and line the flex plate up and make sure that everything is good. So I've got this thing flipped over, and it looks like it's going to line up fine. Sometimes there's some movement from side to side, but like I said, before we go crazy, let's make sure that these things want to thread in, for one thing, and they do. It's got a little bit of Loctite on them, it looks like. I don't know why. I've never had one back out, and I've never used Loctite on a ARP bolt. But okay, so we're all good here, and you can see we have plenty of clearance. We're going to be drawing this thing forward, but it's going to set in the crank like it's supposed to. No issues there. So I just like this. Like I said, this is stuff that in the past has given me fits, and so when you have that problem, you double check this before you get everything up there, especially since that transmission's not exactly the lightest thing. So at this point, I'm going to slide under there and we'll bolt this guy in place. So you can see I've got it up into place, and there is an alignment hole here, so make sure that you line that up just like it was before. The other thing is, guys, there's 3 passes on these, and a lot of times it's going to want to spin around on you, especially if you don't have any spark plugs in like I've got. So I may have to go get my flywheel locking tool that I've used several times on this channel. But 15 the first pass, and I like to go, you know, here, kind of like you'd put a wheel on, and then 37 the second, and 74 for the final. So I'm going to go ahead and torque this all down. Like I said, I may put that on if it starts to spin on me, which I'm sure it will, and then we'll be finished there, and we'll go back to the transmission to put the converter in. So I did end up having to put this in place. I was able to get the 15, the 37, just holding it by hand, but when it came to 74, there was no way. So went ahead and put my flywheel locking tool in there, but now I could take it out. If I had the crank balancer or the balancer ready to put in, I'd leave it, go ahead and put that in, but I don't. So let's go to the transmission. Let's get some fluid poured in the new converter and get it put in the transmission. So before I actually put the converter in the transmission, I cleaned the transmission up a little bit, and it's not perfect, but it is way better. I got all the grease and extra stuff off of it. I'm going to pour this full of fluid. Now, it's a good idea anytime you're putting a converter in to fill it with as much fluid as you can before you actually slide it into place. That way it's not completely dry when you engage the transmission. It doesn't have to pump full. So I'm just using Valvoline, just some Dex 3, nothing fancy here, not synthetic, nothing like that. That's what GM calls for on these transmissions. You guys can use whatever you want. I'll list this below if you decide you want to use that. But we're going to fill this thing up, and then we'll get it into place. So I've got at least a quart to a quart and a half in there now. I did spill a little bit, as you can see, but at this point I'm going to put that in. And guys, really what we're looking for here is we're looking for 3 clicks. I'll set you guys up on the tripod so you can watch me put it in. Some is going to probably run out as you're putting it in. Don't worry about that. You can just wipe that up. The other thing I'm going to do after I do this, I'll show you guys that, but I had to buy another dipstick tube, and these things are just ridiculously expensive for what they are from GM. Now Dorman makes one, but I've had experience in the past where they didn't fit great. I also got the new rubber grommet that goes at the end of this, so I'm going to plug that into the transmission as well. So I'm ready to put this thing in place, and they are heavy, I will tell you that. So we're just going to listen for 3 clicks. You can see there's stuff running out of the bottom. There's one. We're just going to spin it till we hear another click. Maybe I got 3 right there. feeling good about that. Doesn't look like it's all the way in yet. Sometimes it takes a couple times. There we go, there's one. Maybe that's two. There we go. Now it's in. You'll know because this, obviously you have to draw towards the torque converter, or the flex plate, and we're looking good there. So you can keep spinning it around if you'd like, just to make sure. We got that initial click. I had to pull it out a little bit, but there we go. We got 3 clicks now. Now, the other thing is, if your transmission, I'm going to be doing this by myself. If your transmission tilts forward and that thing falls out, you need to make sure that you check that again, making sure it's in all the way. But now we're ready to get this thing on the jack. I'm not going to show you guys the little rubber install here. I'm just going to pull that old one out, put the new one in, and wipe up my mess here. So at this point, I've managed to get the transmission under the car by myself, or the truck, or whatever. And I've got it supported with 2 jacks. I slid a jack under the middle, or under the very front, and then teetered it up onto my other jack. Now, this isn't the best method, but I'm using 2 jacks, one to kind of guide and the other one to balance. And it did leak out some fluid, but that's okay. But before we get this in place, a couple things you want to make note of is on the side of the transmission where the lines plug in, you need to make sure you put those clips in place so we can just plug in and be done. You can put them in after the fact, but it's easier while it's on the ground. Both my clips are in. The other thing is I need to slide my dipstick tube in. I'm going to do it from the bottom and shove it up through the middle here, just because the motor's tilted back, and I think it'll be a little bit easier trying to thread it up because it has that connection that bolts to the transmission. It's kind of hard to sneak it down in the area it needs to be. It needs to come up, in my opinion. That's the easiest way. Now, if the motor were tilted forward, if I tilted the motor forward, which I guess I could, then I could probably thread it down from the top. But we're going to try to get this thing up in place and get a couple bolts started in it. While you're lifting the transmission, you do have to get the dipstick tube in place. It's almost impossible to get it in after the fact. At least it is in the F-body, I know. I don't know about the trucks, but it's just easier to put it in while you're going together. So I went ahead and pushed the dipstick up in place. It goes in between basically your head and the intake, somewhere in the middle there. And I did zip tie it just for now, just so it doesn't fall back in there, because it seems like it wants to fall. Now I just loosely zip tied it to keep it from falling. I still have the ability to push it down in the actual transmission as we're going up. But it's now, I'm gonna grab a couple bolts, and we're gonna see if we can get this thing jacked up into place and get a couple of the bottom bolts started. And then I'll show you guys, we'll talk about torque specs and all of that. So at this point, I have the transmission bolted to the motor. I just lifted it up a little bit at a time until you get the dowels lined up. You have one on the right, one on the left. Once you get those really, really close, you can generally get one started and start to pull the transmission a little forward, and then just start one gradually, one at a time. So I've got them all in there now. And so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and torque them down. 37 foot-pounds is all they get, not a ton. So I'm going to go ahead, run those down, and then probably go ahead and start hooking up some of the electronics. And then the ones with the studs, guys, so the bolts with the studs, they generally go on the top and then along the sides. The one that do not have studs, there's only 2 of them in these transmissions. They're both on the bottom of the bell housing. I can't really show you in the position I'm in, but so the fuel line here on this side is going to bolt to the top one in about the 11 o'clock position. And then the dipstick tube is going to bolt to the one in about the 2 o'clock position. So I'm going to go ahead and put those in after I torque these down, and then we'll probably, like I said, start hooking up some of the electronics, maybe some of the lines, the transmission lines and whatnot, making sure we get everything plugged in before we lift this thing up. The other thing is I have a vent tube right here. I don't know what I did with the rest of it. Hopefully it's in the truck here. I don't remember. But there is a vent tube on top that generally has a check valve and then a line that runs and plugs onto like your transmission mount. So I'll try to show you guys that, but that is your next step, 37 foot-pounds on the bolts. So let's take a look at what I've got accomplished here. So I've got the speed sensor plugged in back in the back. I did find my vacuum line. I cleaned it off and went ahead and hooked it up. And on these older trucks, it's kind of weird because on the older ones, they do have like a vent tube that goes up top, and I went ahead and ran that to the 12 o'clock position. I don't actually think that's the original place. I think it was over here on this side, but it doesn't really matter as long as it's higher than the exit point here. So this other end we'll just rope over the transmission crossmember once we get it in. I also plugged in the lines, so all you have to do is push those in as long as your clips are in place. And I did slide those black keepers up against it. They snap into place as well. The only other thing, let's see here. Oh, I did plug in the main control here on the passenger side. I still have to hook up this guy here. But guys, I am going to drain the fluid that's in here. There's just no good way to do it with the transmission out of the car. At least for me, I don't have a bench to put it on. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and put the mount in. So the new transmission mount, which is this guy here. And I will tell you the cutaway. So it looks almost symmetrical, but you can look at it right here and see that it's not. And this section right here, so hopefully you guys can tell, goes towards the front of the transmission. So I'm going to go ahead and put it in and torque those to 37 foot-pounds, and then hopefully we can get this thing pushed up and the cross member in place. Now that we have everything completely plugged in, including the side of the transmission over here, and the cross member, or the transmission mount is actually on. I'm gonna go grab the cross member. We're gonna jack this transmission up a little bit on the pan, get the cross member in, and then we can go ahead and start draining the fluid. So as you can see, I went ahead and got the trans mount in place, and the cross member and the transmission mount. So 15 millimeter nut that comes through the center. So what we just put on the actual transmission mount itself, there's a 15 millimeter nut that goes on the stud in the center. That guy gets torqued to 30 foot-pounds, and then these guys go to 74 foot-pounds. Now I will tell you guys that when I originally put this up in here, I took the bolts out of the donor truck, which is an extended cab and an older model, and the bolts weren't long enough, so I did have to find some other bolts, and essentially it's the same bolt that goes in the front cross member up there under the engine that I don't have in yet. So I'm going to go ahead and torque these down, and then like I said, I think I'm going to start to loosen the trans pan so I can let that fluid out and drain and change that actual filter and the fluid in the transmission. At this point, I've got that cross member torqued down in place, and I'm going to take these 13 millimeters out and let this pan drain because I do want to change the filter. And like I said, there's just no good way to do this. I don't have a bench to set it on, so this to me is the easiest way. I'm going to go ahead, loosen all those 13s, get that pan out of the way, and let this thing drain out.